In this Flutter tutorial, we'll be learning about stateful and stateless widgets. If you didn't know already, everything in Flutter is almost all widgets. So since widgets are so important to Flutter, let's learn more about it. Both stateful and stateless widget have a build function. You can think of a build function as a way that the widget can render itself onto the screen. Stateful widget has a state and a stateless widget does not have any state. So what is this state? A state can be thought of as a current condition of that widget. So a stateful can have a condition which can change over time, whereas a stateless will not have anything of such sort. So a stateful widget can call its own build function to re-render itself, whereas a stateless can't call its own build function. So these are the main differences between stateful and stateless widget. So let's move on to the computer screen where I will explain more. Let's start by opening VS Code. Let's open the previous project. And let's also start our virtual device. Once our virtual device has started, let's begin by going to the lib folder and creating a new stream called root stream.dart. Let's clear this. And before we start coding, there's a small extension which can help you, which is called Flutter. And let's install this. So what that extension does is it has helpful features like if you were to type stfu, and it will give you a helpful suggestion, and if you press enter, it's gonna create the boilerplate for you. So let's give our class name of root stream, and as you can tell, this is a stateful widget. And let's try to create a new page here, and let's give it a return of scaffold, and body should be a, let's give it a safe area. Start coding it ourselves. So instead of doing that, let's just do something like this. For now, let's create a variable inside the build function. So how we do that is int counter 0, and let's put this inside text to string. We gotta change the int to string. For now, let's just leave it like this. So let's go back to the main function. The material app has a home screen. We don't want this for now. Let's clear this, and instead, let's provide it with root screen. So let's try to run this code. Okay, we have the number here, and let's make sure, let's make it a bit cleaner. Let's make this center, cross-axis alignment, center, in-axis alignment, center. This will still not work if I'm not wrong. Where is the 0 now? Okay, something is off. To start. Okay. let's just give it a style. Restart. Okay, we have this. So now we need some sort of a button to make sure that we can increase this text there. So let's try to do that. To create buttons, there are many ways to create a button. For now, let's just use a basic one called elevated button. And it has a function, it has a parameter called onPress, which requires you to pass a function. So let's just create a function here. And the child should be a text called. So let's try to rerun this. And as you can see, we have a button here. And for now, onPress is so what a function here does is onPressed. Once you press this button, everything inside this curly braces will execute. For now, let's just print I am clicked, such that we can see if this is working. And this print console is logged down here, so you can see exactly when you pressed it. So let's restart it for now. It's restarted, and once I click this, it's going to say I am clicked. So you can see that on pressed this function, whenever I press here, whatever is inside this curly braces is executed. So instead of doing printing, let's do something called counter. Let's increment the counter, and let's print the counter value. Let's see what happens. Okay, I'm gonna restart. Shift R, hot restart. So once I do this, it's gonna say counter value is 1, 2, 3, 4. But as you can see, nothing is changing here. Nothing is changing on the counter value here. Let's see why that happens, and let's put something called, let's just print a statement here that says I am rendering this screen. So now we have a way to find out if this build function is called, if the whole screen or the root screen is being rendered again. So why this does not update is mainly because we are not calling the build function. So once a build function is called, it has to make sure that every time something happens, you call this build function. So let's try to see what happens if we come down here and press Shift R to hot restart, not hot reload. So let's try to see. If I press click me, it's going to say I am rendering this screen, and the counter value is 1. So after the value changes to 1, it should be saying I am rendering this screen again, because this screen is rendered according to counter equals 0. So let's try to click again. It's going to say counter value 2, but we don't render the screen yet. So nothing is being rendered here. That's why even though the value of this variable counter changes, it's not reflected here because we are not telling it to build this screen again. So let's try to do that instead. Let's try to see what happens if I do this. And come here and Shift R to hot restart, not reload. And if as you can see, it's saying I'm rendering this screen. And what this set state does is it tells the widget to rebuild. It will call the build function here. So whenever you are using set state, you have to put, if you're changing the value of this counter here, it has to come before the set state or inside the set state. So this is the syntax for set state. Set state takes a function inside. So this is how you write a function. So let's try to see what happens if we do this. Come here and hot restart. Okay, it rendered for the first time. So let's try click me. Okay, now there's some changes. It says I am rendering this screen, counter value 1. And it says I am rendering this screen, but somehow our value here does not change. So let's try to click again. The counter value is still stuck to 1. It's not changing anymore. The reason this happens is every time you're calling set state, the build function gets called and the counter value is set to 0 again. And every time you come here, it's going to go back to 1. So this is what is meant to have a state. So this is not useful because every time the build function is called, we are initializing the counter to be 0. So instead of doing that, what we can do is create a state. So this is how you create a state inside a stateful widget. Above the build function, you can create your variables here. Int count equal 0. So what this does is every time you create this root screen using the constructor, which we are doing here, root screen, this will be created with a state called count. And this count we are initializing as 0. So instead of sending the counter here, let's remove this and let's try to see what happens. And something is wrong here. Oh, it's counter. So let's try to come here and shift R. Okay, it has restarted. So now it's still working because the counter has 0, and when it renders first, the counter should be 0. So if I were to press click me, it's gonna say I'm rendering this screen, counter value is 1, I'm rendering this screen, and we are no longer setting the counter on the build function, so it is outside the build function. So this is being saved outside the build function. So we can change the value from the build function here, and it will not affect when we are building. So this is why this is called a state, because this variable is being saved outside the build function. So now you can see when we increase the value here and we are calling the set state, it's going to call the build function again, and when it comes down and builds the entire screen, it's going to use the counter value from the state of the stateful widget. So this is how you use a stateful widget. So now let's use a stateless widget with a stateful widget and see how it all works out. So the stateless widget which we created was a custom widget that we had in the previous video. So let's call this widget inside our root screen. For that, let me clear everything here. And for now, let's make it a bit cleaner by wrapping this guy with a container and giving a height of the screen size and also the width. Let's just give it a color for first render to see where the size we are working with. As you can see, it covers the whole screen, so we are working with the entire red space. So let's remove the color here. If not, let's just give it a gray color. Let's see, from the home screen. Okay, something like this. Let's give that color off. Let's see. Okay. So let's call the custom widget and bring it inside our column here. Let's keep it going this way. Okay, let's restart. Shift R. I was having some issues with my Flutter project here, so that's why it was showing some error here, but I fixed it. You shouldn't have that error if you followed along the video tutorial. So let's begin. So what we want to be looking at is a text input field, or for now let's use text field. And what a text field is a place where you can enter text inside your app. So let's give it some padding, or use a container and give it a padding. Horizontal 24. Let's give it a color of white. Okay, we gotta give a vertical pad as well. I can't clearly see what's going on for now, so let's remove this. Remove the color, and we have our text field here. So the problem of the over rendering, you can solve it by creating this guy. Let's clear that. Okay, for now let's just give it some borders to the text field. And to do that, what you need to do is, if you look here, there should be something called in decorations, and it takes input decoration. All right, let's see inside input decoration. There should be a property called border, and outline input border is something you will take. Yeah, as you can see here, input border is an abstract class, so you have to look this up in Flutter's documentation. For now, let's just use outline input border. Let's see what happens. Okay, we got some border here. At least we know what we're working with. So a text field will take anything you type here, and you can do anything you want with it. So how do we capture, or let's just create something, another button before we do any of that. So the way we've seen how to create a button using elevated button, but the way I prefer to make my buttons is creating a container and give it a text, for example. And just say and let's just style this container a bit. And let's style the text as well. So after I make something like this, what I'd like to do is, let's just increase the thing here, font weight. Center the text so that it comes to the center. And let's just give some margins. Okay, we have some sort of a button looking widget here. So how do we make this into a button is by making sure that this is covered by another widget, which is called a gesture detector. So if you see here, gesture detector will take something called on tap. A lot of this other functions, but you can use a simple one called on tap, and you can make a button like this, such that if you tap here, any function, anything inside these curly braces will run. But if you want to make it a bit more stylish, you can use something called inkwell. And what's the difference is inkwell has something called a splash. So if I were to restart hot reload and click here, it should have a splash. Somehow it's not working right now, but let's skip over that, it's not important. Okay, now we have a button here, and we have to, let's just take whatever we type here and print inside the terminal whenever we press click me. So let's type something here, and if we were to press here, we need to print the whatever we type here inside the terminal. So how are we going to do that is, we first have to capture whatever we type inside this text field, and using that we can print whatever is typed here. So a text field has something called a text editing controller. Let's create a state or a variable inside the state, text editing controller, and let's just be controller text editing controller. So what this does is this is a variable of data type text editing controller, and this guy will have access to whatever is inside this text field. So it's some sort of a controller. So if we were to put the controller, which we initialize here, inside the controller parameter, we can have access to whatever is typed here. So let's see. What we want to do is, using the controller, and controller has something called text, we can print the text using that controller. So let's try to see what happens. Copy and Shift R. Let's restart it. Let's just stay. And if I were to press click me, it's gonna say hello Flutter. So this is how we have access to text fields, or the things we type inside text field. So what we need to do right now is, instead of sending the title here, what we can do is use the controller. Okay, for now let's create something called another variable title. Let's initialize it with just title, and let's pass this variable inside the custom text field, such that we are able to change the title from here. So if you were to do this, what we can do is, once we get to on tap, if we tap here, we want to change this state of this title to be something else, or to be more specific to the control, the text inside the controller. So let's create a set state and put this here, and let's just change the title variable to whatever is inside this controller's text. So if we were to do this, and let's restart, Shift R. Okay, for now it's just a title because we've initialized it as just a title, and we are using title to build this custom widget. And if we were to say and if I were to press this, it's gonna set the state of the title to be something else, and it's gonna rebuild the app. And once it gets to this point, the title has already been changed to I am more than a title, so it should display that the title is changed to I am more than a title. If I were to press here, as you can see, this is how you can use a stateful widget to change the parameters of a stateless widget. Okay, now the question is, when are you supposed to use stateful and stateless widget? the best, there's no actual answer to it. You just have to use your own according to your needs, and we'll create a necessity such that we'll see why we need to use stateful for some and stateless for some. In general, what I'd like to do is for screens I use stateful widget, and smaller things like smaller widget like this, I try to use stateless as much as possible, because a stateless widget is less intensive on the phone. So let's clear all this, and I'll create a use case where you want to see why you want to use a stateful widget instead. So let's clear the bottom part here, the text field and all, and let's duplicate this. And instead of description, description 1, description 2, I'll clear this for now. Okay, this as well. So let's see what happens. Okay, we have 2 of these here. Somehow it's not rendering. It's because of 150 pixels. Okay, there should be, I will not specify the height here. Let's restart. It should be working now. Okay, let's just give it some spacing here using a size box. Okay, so as you can tell, we created this custom widget as a stateless widget. But if you were to look in the widget, there's something called there's a heart button inside, and we have to make sure that when we click the heart button, it should change color or something. So we can't do that with the stateless widget. If not, we have to create a lot of other states on the root screen itself, such that we can track the value of the state of individual widget. So instead of doing that, what we can do is, if we have a lot of this kind of custom widget, we have to create a lot more states here, such that we can keep track of the state of this custom widget. So instead of doing that, what we can do is create this, convert this into a stateful widget. So let's do that. Come here, and you can just do control refactor if I'm not wrong. Okay, convert this to stateful widget. So the Flutter extension helps you do this as well. So now this has become a stateful widget. What we can do is we can create a state called boolean is left or is favorite equal. Let's just make sure that once we create this custom widget, which we are doing here, the initial value of is favorite is false. And what we are going to do is let's change the color of the heart button here, not that, but the background color, since that is easier. Let's see where it is. I think it's this one. Okay, instead of white, what we can do is come here, copy this. We can use this operator. If this value is true, we want the background to be red. So what this means is, if this variable results in true, use this value. If not, use this value. So now each of these has their own state called is favorite, and what we need to do is make sure that once we click here, this value changes. So what we gotta do is we gotta make sure this container becomes clickable. And how we are gonna do that is, we've seen it earlier, we can use something like gesture detector or inkwell. For now, let's just use inkwell since it is pretty simple, and it has a property called onTap. So what we are going to do is, once we tap this, we are going to change this into a true. And if we were to restart, we should expect that if we were to click here, the background is going to change to red. Okay, it's restarted. Let's click. Oh, this is why it's not working, because I'm not using set state, so it's not really rebuilding the whole widget itself. So let's restart. I think it's restarted. Okay, let's click here. It's going to turn to red. So these are some use cases where you want to use a stateful widget instead. Lastly, before I go, let's just make it a bit useful, because right now it's only clicking and it's not changing again. We gotta make sure it toggles. So what we can do is we can use the inverse value of the current state. So if it's false, it's gonna inverse that value and set that value into the inverse. So if you were to restart this, we can make it toggleable like this. So if I click here, nothing changes here. The reason is because each of these has their own little state. So this guy's favorite is set to true now, and the bottom one has its own state and it's not changed yet. So I can come here and change it. So this is why this is one use case of using stateful widget. So to summarize, you use stateful widget if the state is somehow dependent on its own self and not dependent on the outside widget. So that is all for stateful versus stateless widget. In the next video, we will be discussing how to run the application on our actual Android device instead of using just this simulator. It makes it a lot faster, and we'll also use a software to display what is being displayed on our Android onto our screen here, so it will be easier to develop. So that is all for this video. Until then, see you soon.